The separation of power often used inaccurately and interchangeably with the trial political, which is the model for the government of a state or for who controls the state. The state is divided into branches which separate an independent power and area of responsibility under this model. Therefore, the power of one branch is not in a conflict with the power associated with the other branches. The typical division of branches is legislative, executive, and judiciary. Separation of power are also pillars of rule of the law. There is no separation of executive and legislative power because of the cabinet type of the state. This fusion of legislative, judiciary, and executive function was inherited from the Westminster system. There are three branches of government, which is executive, the judicial, and legislative authorities. The executive branch of the government consists of the Prime Minister as head of the government, followed by the various ministers of the cabinets. It formulates various socio-economic policies and development plans for the development of the country as a whole. The Cabinet of Ministers is the body in charge of carrying out the Yang di-Pertuan Agong executive duties. Cabinet's policy are responsibilities carried out by the federal or central government administrative body. The Prime Minister leads the Cabinet, which is formed of ministers who each have a certain portfolio. The function of the Cabinet is to advise the Yang di-Pertuan Agong in governance. The Cabinet's other role is to determine the budget and finances. Taxes, penalties, summonses, custom charges and fees are always for the government to obtain money from the people. The executive branch, strictly speaking, has no authorities to interfere in the state's legislative or judicial branches.
Legislative authorities. Parliament is the legislative power for the Federation and it makes laws to enforce throughout the country. Parliament passes federal laws, makes amendments to existing federal laws, examines government policies, approve government spending and approve new taxes. Parliament also serves as a forum to discuss matters of public interest, to enable Parliament to carry out its responsibilities fully and effectively. The Constitution grants certain legal rights and immunities under the parliamentary privileges to members of Parliament. Generally, members of Parliament individually from civil and criminal proceedings with respect to things said or done by them in parliamentary proceedings.
Judiciary power. Judiciary in Malaysia are courts. Judiciary of Malaysia is largely centralized despite Malaysia's federal constitution heavily influenced by the English common law. As well as Islamic jurisprudence, there are generally two types of trial, criminal and civil. The hierarchy of courts begins from the magistrate court, session courts, high court, court of appeal, and finally the federal courts. The jurisdiction of the courts in civil or criminal matters are contained in the Subordinate Court Act 1948 and the Courts of Judicature Act 1964. Article 121 of the Constitution provide for two high courts of coordinate jurisdiction, the High Court in Malaya and the High Court in Sabah and Sarawak. Thus, this creates two separate local jurisdiction of the courts for Peninsula Malaysia and for East Malaysia. There are several types of court in Malaysia. Firstly, the Federal Court is the highest court in Malaysia. The Federal Court may hear appeals of civil decision of the Court of Appeal where the Federal Court grants leave to do so. The Federal Court also hears criminal appeals from the Court of Appeal, but only in respect of matters heard by the High Court in its original jurisdiction, where the case has not been appealed from the subordinate courts. Secondly, the Court of Appeal generally hears all civil appeals against decision of the High Courts, except where against judgment or orders made by consent. In cases where the claim ringgit, the judgment or order relates to costs only and the appeal is against a decision of a judge in chambers or an interpleader summons on undisputed facts. The leave of the Court of Appeal must first be obtained. The Court of Appeal also hears appeals of criminal decision of the High Court. It is the court of final jurisdiction for cases which began in any subordinate courts.
Parlimen consists of the Yang di-Pertuan Agong YDPA, the House of Representatives, Dewan Rakyat, and the Senate, which is Dewan Negara. Parliament makes amends and abolish law which are called Act of Status. The Constitution says what laws Parliament can or cannot make and the procedure for making laws. The government consists of Yang di-Pertuan Agong, Prime Minister, Cabinet Ministers and the Public Service. The government runs the country according to the constitutions and the law made by the Parliament. There are several types of courts in Malaysia such as the civil courts, the Sharia courts and the native courts. Each of these courts has its own power and functions. The courts decide on legal disputes, which include disputes between people and between people and the government.
I will explain about how are the powers of Parliament checked. Parliament makes laws, but the courts have the power to say what a law means when there is uncertainty or if one law contradicts another law. The court may also say a law is against the Constitution and therefore need not to be followed. After that, how are the powers of the government checked by Parliament? Elected representative of the Dewan Rakyat can require the Prime Minister or Cabinet to explain anything that the government has or has not done. If the Cabinet acts against the wishes of the Dewan Rakyat, then the Dewan Rakyat can pass a motion of no confidence against the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister and his Cabinet should then resign. Here, the Dewan Rakyat, example Parliament, ensure that the government acts in the best interest of the people and does not abuse its power.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Anis Aidatul Shifa binti Abdul Razak. How are the powers of the government checked by the courts? The court can review actions by the government and if those actions are against the constitution or the laws made by Parliament, then the court can correct those actions. However, some argue that the court's power is limited and therefore it cannot review certain action by the government. How are the powers of the courts checked? If a judge commits misbehavior or violates the judge code of ethics, or if he or she is psychological or physically incapable of continuing to serve as a judge, the Prime Minister can request that the YDPA appoint a tribunal to determine whether the judge should be removed from office. Other judges make up this tribunal. Either the Dewan Rakyat or the Dewan Negara can debate the conduct of a judge, but only if a motion to do is supported by at least 1/4 of the total members of. In other words, Parliament and the government can recommend that action be taken against a judge who abused his or her power. But it is only other members of the court that can decide if a judge is to be removed from office.
Important separation of power to development. To development is stop abuse of power and safeguard freedom. Another important of separation is the separation power requires that government be divided into 3 branches, which is executive, legislative, and judiciary. This is because to balance and limit government power.
Issue of separation powers. Judiciary in Malaysia is reviewed as an independent body according to the constitution, but since 1988 judicial crisis, the powers of judiciary are held upon by the parliament instead of the body itself as before the crisis. It is well known that prior to the crisis, the judiciary in Malaysia is highly independent and a well-respected body. Since the crisis, the Attorney General has had the authority to determine on behalf of the judiciary whether or not to accept or reject cases. It all started when the then Chief Justice Tun Saleh Abbas pronounced the major conflict of the ruling party, UMNO, unconstitutional. The UMNO president at the time, Tun Mahathir Mohamad, believed that the executive and legislative branches of government were far more powerful than the judiciary, and that the latter should not interfere with executive decision. Tun Saleh Abbas and 2 other federal court judges were removed as a result of this line of event, and the present law was amended to put the judiciary squarely under the supervision of the other bodies.
Solution of the issue. In this situation, the two rules functions are closely connected. The judiciary, on the other hand, should not be controlled or dominated by any other body if it is to work independently and fairly. When it comes to making decisions, judges should not be affected by the executive branch, and they should have the authority to review and influence any measures approved by Parliament. As a result, the separation of powers either in a parliamentary system such as Malaysia's can be better described as a power fusion to make a decision in the concept of parliament democracy. There is no true apparent separation of powers. The executive and legislative branches of government are in the same boat, but the judiciary, which has the least power, is in a separate boat. However, the fusion of power should be treated seriously in order to avoid any conflicts between these recognized authorities and to ensure that their responsibilities are carried out effectively for the future and direction of our country.